Right now, there's a 99% chance you have something made by this family within arm's reach. Your phone, your TV, your computer chips, maybe even the ship that brought your Amazon package. But here's what's insane. This empire controls $3.7 trillion in assets. That's more than the GDP of France, more than Apple and Microsoft combined. Yet most people can't even name the family behind it. They've survived assassination attempts, prison sentences, tax evasion scandals worth billions, and a corruption case that brought down an entire government. 3 generations have built the most powerful dynasty in Asia, starting from selling dried fish and sugar. This is the untold story of the Lee family and how Samsung became more powerful than most countries. And trust me, this gets absolutely wild. March 1, 1910, Japan annexes Korea. For the next 35 years, Koreans lived under brutal colonial rule. Most families were dirt poor, struggling to survive. But one man saw opportunity in chaos. Lee Byung-chul was born in 1910 to a wealthy landowning family. While most Koreans had nothing, Lee's father owned so much land that young Lee never had to work a day in his life. He could have just lived off that wealth forever. But in 1938, at age 28, he did something that seemed crazy. He took his inheritance and started a small trading company in Daegu. The name, Samsung, which literally means 3 stars in Korean. What did Samsung sell? Dried fish, noodles, sugar, basically whatever made money. Lee Byung-chul had one philosophy that would define Samsung for the next 80 years. Do what makes profit, adapt or die. For the first decade, Samsung was nothing special, just another trading company. But then 1950 happened. The Korean War broke out. The entire country was destroyed. Cities were rubble. Millions died. It was absolute devastation. And Lee Byung-chul, he fled to Busan with nothing. Samsung headquarters destroyed, his assets gone. Most people would have given up, but Lee saw something nobody else did. He knew Korea would need to rebuild, and whoever controlled that rebuilding would control the future. So in the 1950s, while Korea was still smoking ruins, Lee started buying into industries nobody wanted: sugar refinement, textiles, insurance, fertilizer. By 1960, Samsung wasn't just a trading company anymore. It was becoming a conglomerate. But Lee wanted more, much more. In 1969, Lee made the decision that would change everything. He looked at Japan's success with Sony and Panasonic and thought, why can't Korea do that? Everyone told him he was insane. Korea was poor, they had no technology, no expertise, no chance. Lee didn't care. He founded Samsung Electronics. The first product, a black and white TV, it was terrible, it barely worked. But Lee had a vision: Korea would become a technology superpower, and Samsung would lead it. Now here's where the story gets interesting. Because Lee Byung-chul wasn't just building a company, he was building an empire that would outlast him. In the 1970s, South Korea's government had a strategy: pick a few massive companies, give them unlimited support, and let them dominate entire industries. These companies were called chaebols. Samsung was the biggest chaebol of them all. Lee had a deal with the government. Samsung would drive Korea's economic growth, and in return they'd get special treatment: loans, tax breaks, protection from competition. It was capitalism with Korean characteristics. And Lee was ruthless about it. He had a management philosophy called change everything except your wife and children. He'd wake up executives at 3 a.m. to discuss strategy. He'd fire entire departments on a whim. One time, he reportedly made executives watch him burn a pile of defective phones worth millions, just to prove a point about quality. But it worked. By 1980, Samsung was in everything: shipbuilding, construction, chemicals, life insurance, hotels, and of course, electronics. Then in 1987, Lee Byung-chul died. He'd built one of the largest companies in Asia, but now came the tricky part, passing it to the next generation. Enter Lee Kun-hee, the third son. Now Lee Kun-hee wasn't the obvious choice. He was quiet, studied in Japan and the US, preferred art collecting to business. His older brothers seemed more qualified. But Lee Byung-chul saw something in him, a strategic mind, a willingness to make hard decisions. And boy, did Lee Kun-hee make hard decisions. In 1993, Lee Kun-hee gathered all of Samsung's top executives in Frankfurt, Germany. He'd been touring Samsung stores across Europe and was horrified. Samsung products were cheap garbage, low quality, low price, low respect. So he gave a speech that became legendary. Change everything except your wife and children. From now on, I want you to think about quality, not quantity. Make one great product, not 10 mediocre ones. Then he did something absolutely insane. He ordered employees to gather $50 million worth of Samsung phones and fax machines. Then he made 2,000 employees watch as he burned it all in a giant bonfire. The message was clear. Samsung's old way was dead, quality or nothing. Over the next decade, Lee Kun-hee transformed Samsung from a cheap electronics maker into a premium brand. He poached the best engineers from Sony and Motorola. He invested billions into R&D. He created the smartphone chips that would eventually power iPhones. By 2005, Samsung had overtaken Sony. By 2012, they were the world's biggest phone maker, beating Nokia and Apple. The shy art collector had turned Samsung into a tech giant. But power corrupts, and absolute power, that's when things get really messy. Here's the dark side nobody talks about. In 2008, Lee Kun-hee was convicted of tax evasion. The amount, $112 million. He'd been hiding money through borrowed names and slush funds. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and fined $109 million. But here's the crazy part. He never spent a day in jail. The South Korean president pardoned him because, and I quote, "The country needs him to help secure the 2018 Winter Olympics." That's the kind of power we're talking about, too important to jail. But that was nothing compared to what happened in 2016. Lee Kun-hee had a heart attack in 2014 and was in a coma. So his son, Lee Jae-yong, took over as de facto leader, the third generation. And immediately, he got caught up in the biggest corruption scandal in South Korean history. President Park Geun-hye was being controlled by a shadowy confidant named Choi Soon-sil. And Samsung had allegedly paid $37 million in bribes to this woman to get government support for a merger that would cement Lee Jae-yong's control. When it all came out, the president was impeached, Choi went to prison, and Lee Jae-yong arrested. In 2017, the heir to the Samsung empire was thrown in jail, 5 years sentence. South Korea erupted, massive protests. People were furious that the chaebols thought they were above the law. But again, power talks. Lee Jae-yong served less than a year, released on appeal, then rearrested, then released again, then pardoned in 2022. The official reason for the pardon: South Korea's economy needs Samsung's leadership. Because here's the thing, Samsung isn't just a company in South Korea, it is South Korea. Samsung Electronics alone accounts for 20% of South Korea's entire GDP. $1 in $5 in the Korean economy flows through Samsung. They employ 270,000 people directly, millions more indirectly. They're the country's biggest exporter, biggest R&D spender, biggest everything. When Lee Jae-yong goes to jail, Korea's stock market drops. When he's released, it rises. That's not a company, that's a shadow government. So let's talk about just how massive this empire actually is. Samsung isn't one company. It's 80+ companies under one umbrella, and they control everything. Samsung Electronics. Obviously, they make your phones, TVs, and most importantly, semiconductor chips. They're the world's largest memory chip manufacturer. Every iPhone has Samsung components. Samsung Heavy Industries. They build massive ships and oil rigs, one of the world's top shipbuilders. Samsung Engineering and Construction. They built the Burj Khalifa, the Petronas Towers, the Taipei 101, iconic skyscrapers across Asia. Samsung Life Insurance, biggest life insurer in Korea. Samsung C&T, fashion hotels, resorts. Samsung Biologics, pharmaceutical manufacturing. Total revenue across all Samsung companies, over $400 billion annually. That's bigger than the GDP of Norway. Total assets, $3.7 trillion. Let that sink in. For comparison, Apple's total assets, $352 billion. Amazon's total assets, $462 billion. Entire U.S. federal budget, $6.1 trillion. Samsung, a single-family business, controls assets worth more than half the U.S. government's annual budget. And it's all controlled by one family. The Lee family owns only 5% of Samsung Electronics directly, but through a complex web of cross-shareholdings between Samsung companies, they maintain absolute control. It's genius and completely legal. But here's what keeps the Lee family up at night: China. Chinese companies like Huawei, Xiaomi, and BYD are catching up fast. They've got government backing, lower costs, and massive scale. And then there's AI. The chip game is changing. NVIDIA is dominating AI chips. Samsung's memory chip advantage might not matter in an AI-first world. Lee Ye-yong knows this. Since getting out of prison, he's been on a mission, visiting chip factories, meeting with CEOs globally, investing $230 billion into chip manufacturing. Because he knows what his grandfather knew: adapt or die. The question is, can the third generation maintain what the first built and the second perfected? But we need to talk about the cost of this empire. Samsung has faced multiple scandals about worker conditions. In 2018, Lee Ye-yong had to publicly apologize after reports that factory workers were getting sick from chemical exposure. Some had died. Labor unions have protested for decades about long hours and surveillance. Samsung fought unions until 2020 when they finally allowed them. And the tax situation. When Lee Kun-hee died in 2020, his family owed $12 billion in inheritance taxes, the largest tax bill in Korean history. How are they paying it? By selling art, real estate, and Samsung shares over years. Even for the Lee family, $12 billion is painful. But despite everything, the scandals, the bribes, the controversies, Samsung keeps growing. They're betting everything on AI chips, quantum computing, and biotechnology. Lee Ye-yong is meeting with every major tech CEO. He's positioning Samsung to be essential in the AI revolution. Because that's what the Lee family does. They survive, they adapt, they dominate. From dried fish in 1938 to AI chips in 2026, from Japanese colonial rule to global tech leadership, 3 generations, one family, one unstoppable empire. The Lee family doesn't just make products, they make the things that make the things. They're invisible but everywhere. The richest Asian dynasty nobody talks about. And now you know their secret. If this video opened your eyes to how deep the rabbit hole goes with these business empires, you need to hit that subscribe button, because next week, I'm exposing the family that controls 70% of India's telecom and has connections to almost every major industry in that country. Drop a comment. Did you know Samsung was this massive? What other secret empires should I cover? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.